Since Sea of Thieves and Skull and Bones have been announced, people have been picking sides and debating which one is better and which one offers the best piracy experience in a niche that was ever lacking. And you really can't blame anyone for comparing these two games. Even the initial announcement trailers kinda had a similar feel if you look back. They both feature epic battles on the high seas, plundering, mystery, and mythical sea creatures. Everything you could expect from a long-awaited pirate game. It is fascinating to observe the diverse opinions and perspectives regarding the comparison of these games. Many people believe that one game will outdo the other, while others argue that both games have their unique features. However, it is quite unusual to compare these games, as they merely share a common pirate theme. Moreover, both games had issues at launch, which is one of the notable similarities between them. It's also funny how both games have big companies behind them and both had vast budgets to aggressively push out marketing campaigns, portraying them as fully fledged AAA games. After many direction changes, budget exceeds and development issues, Skull and Bones ended up being this live service game that resembles an RPG in which your main character is the ship. I say this because all the focus is set on gathering loot and grinding to upgrade it. It's probably more reasonable to compare it to something like Forza Horizon at this point. On the other hand, Sea of Thieves had this beautifully handcrafted world, but there wasn't enough content at launch. The ships were not upgradable, the progression worked very different from Skull and Bones, as there is no difference in terms of equipment between a new player and a veteran. The only real progression that is available is purely based on cosmetics. But to better understand why there is so much noise around these games, we need to go way back to 2013 when Black Flag was launched. This was a very appreciated sequel to the Assassin's Creed series. The setting was very refreshing. The sailing and plundering mechanics offered an immersive piracy experience with sea shanties, exploration and swashbuckling. All this just made people ask for more, since Black Flag still followed the Assassin's Creed narrative and gameplay mechanics. I think that the expectations weren't that exaggerated, since Black Flag was already a solid pirate game. They just needed to adapt it to a multiplayer setting, add some relevant progression and maybe change the narrative. There was also a void in this whole niche for a similar multiplayer experience, where you could fight, plunder and sink other players' ships. After all, online gaming is only fun if you know that at the other end there is someone who is suffering, and an open world piracy experience where you could just take down other players and steal their hard-earned loot made perfect sense. Now I know that Black Wake was released at some point and it offered a pretty solid experience, but it came from a smaller studio and eventually it died down because there wasn't enough content to keep the players engaged for longer. When it comes to Skull and Bones, it sounded pretty straightforward. Ubisoft just needed to build on top of the Black Flag foundation and adapt some of the gameplay mechanics to fit a multiplayer open world experience. So they kicked off as a multiplayer expansion for Assassin's Creed Black Flag back in 2013. Then they decided to go bigger, becoming its own massive pirate adventure, almost like an MMO on the open seas. Fast forward, it was unveiled at E3 2017 with all the bells and whistles, gameplay and cinematic trailers. The multiplayer gameplay trailer showed this epic tactical battle in which you compete with other players for loot and showcase the different ship types along with the diverse arsenal that was available. All this sounded good, and it seemed like all those options in terms of ships and equipment would add a lot of depth to the game, as all this was supposed to happen within a vast world filled to the brink with content and stuff to do. The high seas seemed more promising than ever, and all the pirate enthusiasts already started to compare it to Sea of Thieves, which at that time was already announced 2 years prior and was due to be released in 2018. The comparison between Sea of Thieves and Skull and Bones was inevitable, because we had these two big companies that were investing a lot of money into these games, belonging to a niche that was neglected for quite a lot of time. Rare was backed by Microsoft, which had pretty much unlimited money, and they really went big with Sea of Thieves. Like, they heavily invested in marketing and even had a custom Xbox controller for it. And you could tell that Ubisoft went big with Skull and Bones, as they already went overboard with the budget a couple of times. You might think that all this could only benefit the end consumer, right? We had to get some epic results, right? Well, it didn't go that well, and as you already know by now, both games spent about a decade in development and had disastrous launches. Skull and Bones was delayed about 6 times before we eventually got the release, and when it finally launched, it turned out to be a major disappointment since it seemed like over the years they literally scraped most of the fun stuff out of it.
Forget everything you know about the traditional pirate fantasy. Skull and Bones.
No!
But that's what I like.
No! Like, already you're starting on the wrong foot. Like, what?
Somehow we were only left with the naval combat part of the game, along with the crafting system that requires you to do a number of contracts by gathering materials and taking down NPC ships. Sea of Thieves had an incredible concept and a beautifully crafted world, but it lacked sufficient content upon its initial release. Despite being part of Microsoft, Rare is a relatively small game development studio compared to other AAA studios. Hence, Sea of Thieves was a challenging and ambitious project for them. The unique concept and live service formula were new territories for the studio, making it even more challenging. Like, the concept is really solid and the setting for an awesome experience is there. We have this sandbox in which they just needed to add more mechanics and tools to keep the players engaged. The developers admitted the lack of content and promised that they would work on releasing new free content. And to be honest, the players had the right to be upset since Sea of Thieves was packaged and priced as a AAA game. Opinions were a bit mixed since some players were saying that you just needed to make your own fun. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a day one Sea of Thieves player. I loved this game, had great memories and had loads of fun, even in its bare bones state when it first launched. But the price was just too high for a game in which you could only do 3 different fetch quests and the only available progression was only offering a bunch of cosmetics. If you're still watching, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. I'm just starting out and it would help a lot. Now that we have a better understanding on how these games came to be, let's dive into the actual gameplay mechanics, loop and the overall feel. In Skull and Bones, they ended up placing the action into the Indian Ocean, which again, it's quite a weird decision since the initial location was meant to be the Caribbean. It made more sense if you ask me, since that was the main hotspot for piracy and the most successful pirate movies and series had that setting as well. The second option was a fantasy world, which would have been interesting as well. Having the possibility to develop this vast pirate world could also spark the curiosity in players and the spirit of exploration. Speaking of fantasy worlds, Sea of Thieves went in that direction, and their world is probably the most solid aspect of the game. It's just stunning, and don't get me started about the water, since it's the best looking water I've seen in video games. All this, it's also combined with their amazing soundtrack, which takes everything to another level. Although the Skull and Bones world is way bigger, it lacks ambience due to the absence of music, like it's barely anything playing in the background. It feels like they cut out the most important aspects when it comes to atmosphere. The first few hours of Sea of Thieves are amazing. You spawn at one of the taverns and from that very moment you are immersed into this world that feels so alive and shrouded in mystery. There's this feeling of exploration and adventure that makes you wonder what's hiding around the corner and what is there to discover on all these islands scattered across the sea. The interface is minimal, as it will only show you your health and ammo. You need to pull up your treasure map and compare it to the world map that's only available on your ship. Sailing is made in a similar fashion. You need to interact with your sails, anchor and wheel independently in order to navigate the high seas. As simple as this may sound, there is a learning curve to it, as it's hard to control initially. You'll probably crash into an island a couple of times and pull down your anchor in panic before it becomes smooth sailing. All these little things combined make up for a really immersive experience when you first step into the Sea of Thieves. The first treasure hunt and the first solved riddle, it really makes you feel like a pirate. In Skull and Bones, the tutorial begins with a battle against the British Navy, where players can learn the basics of ship maneuvering and combat. The game mechanics seem quite basic and arcadey. You simply press W to move forward and use A and D to steer. The wind in this game feels off, as it seems to only be there to slow you down. You can't move your sails to catch the wind and it will randomly slow you down from time to time. I must admit, after playing Sea of Thieves, this game feels quite underwhelming. After the initial battle, you kinda start a story and the intro to everything that's going on in Skull and Bones. And all this feels quite long. They have you going from place to place, doing a bunch of boring quests in which you gather resources and craft items. You're introduced to the main plot and objective, and that is your journey to becoming a pirate kingpin. From here you need to do a couple of more contracts in which you will unlock a bunch of merchants that will help you with crafting the new ships and upgrading them. When it comes to on-foot exploration, you are very limited and can only disembark on designated outposts. Here you can just pick up some more quests, cook some food, trade with the vendors, or gather resources. That's unfortunate as it takes a lot from the game. You are just visiting these hubs to manage your inventory, and believe me, you will do a lot of it in this game, because everything it's about that. You need to check out all these items and read them to figure out if you either need to keep them, sell them, or craft them into something else. I swear, it becomes tedious really fast. It just takes away that immersion when games have you spend a lot of time in menus, sorting through crap and reading all these bits of information from objectives and other tasks that are not that relevant. The inventory it's also global, and most of the time you just complete contracts instantly because you already have the resources. You'd imagine that a game heavily based on hauling resources from place to place and that it's only based on navigation would encourage you to actually deliver them. On top of this, resources are quite easy to get since most of the time you randomly stumble across them when you are sailing around and you just need to spam F to pick everything up. I don't even want to get started with the lazy approach that they took when it comes to boarding and gathering resources. This was a major deal breaker for me. I even made fun of it in my last video. It reminds me of those crappy mobile games that you see advertised all over the place. This is why I appreciate the simplicity of Sea of Thieves when it comes to interface and loot management. All your items have a physical representation in game. You have to interact with each of it to store it safely until you deliver it. And this is where the fun of an open world PvP pirate game comes into play. In Sea of Thieves, you constantly need to be on your guard because enemy ships are a constant threat, and until the moment you deliver your precious loot, you are at risk of losing it all. Back at Skull and Bones, things are not looking good at all in terms of PvP. Basically, you can't attack people on the open sea, and you can only engage in PvP combat if you join a particular event. And if you thought that it couldn't get any worse, apparently people can cheese these events by fast traveling and by abusing the lack of restrictions related to how grouping works. I think they announced PvP servers, but we will see how that goes. You can't compare this to Sea of Thieves in terms of PvP, like even immediately after launch when you only had 3 fetch quests to do and only school forts as world events. People were having massive battles and it was fun for a while. I say for a while because you weren't gaining much by fighting the same crews over and over again for a fort, but the fights in which all the ships on the server were involved were quite epic and I had a blast clearing forts during that period. The base for this to happen was already there and we kinda made our own fun for a while, and I know that is not ideal when you pay $60 for a game, but at least there was this option. The fundamentals were there, we just needed more stuff to do and more reasons to go out there into the world. Sea of Thieves also had issues related to PvP, like the insanely close respawn locations for sunk ships where you'd end up fighting the same crew over and over again because they would just respawn close by and jump back into the fight. They tweaked that later on and the respawn locations are more balanced nowadays, but it could lead to some really annoying endless fights. The progression also plays a major role when it comes to how these games work in terms of PvP. As I mentioned before, in Sea of Thieves, a fresh player has access to the same weapons and ships as a player that has been playing for years. The only difference is that the latter has more experience using them. Apart from the ship cosmetics and pirate clothes, there is nothing that can indicate how much time you have invested into the game. And this type of progression might not be for everyone. Honestly, as much as I love Sea of Thieves, I am not into collecting all the available cosmetics, commendations and titles, as this was probably the factor that kept me from playing constantly. On the other hand, Skull and Bones had a progression that feels quite grindy and similar to an MMORPG. You do a bunch of quests and advance the story to unlock more ships, guns and equipment, ultimately making you more deadly on the sea. Here you can tell pretty fast if a player has invested more time into the game based on their level and ship, but griefing shouldn't be an issue as you can't randomly attack any player-controlled ship in the open world. The AI ships that you need to fight while doing contracts and the open world events are not really a challenge. With the current ship repair mechanics, I feel like you don't even need the latest guns in order to tackle them. Even when I was surrounded by enemy ships, I could just use the repair kit over and over again and continue to take them down. Everything feels too simplified and arcadey. While both games have their issues, I feel like Sea of Thieves at least had an interesting concept that embodied a genuine pirate experience. Even if it's not a game that I constantly play, I come back from time to time either to check out the new Tall Tales or just for some chaos on the high seas. I feel like the updates have added a lot to the game, and for fresh eyes, I imagine that it can be captivating. The developers listened to some extent to the player base and slowly implemented much needed features and quality of life adjustments. Its progression solely based on cosmetics and its tall tales might not be for everyone, but it managed to gather a great community over the years. On the other hand, Skull and Bones is still fresh and its launch wasn't that smooth, to say the least, but we will see if it will endure the test of time as Ubisoft promised major content updates and fixes. In its current state, I feel like Skull and Bones would be better off as a free-to-play game based on what it has to offer at the moment. The price tag and development time don't reflect the end product in any way. Either way, I hope that both games improve from this point on, as there are still gaps in this niche and any content updates are well welcome. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below, as I would like to hear your opinion as well. Thanks for watching and see you on the next one.